In 1957, Vincent Gigante walked into a social club on 116th Street and made a joke. Just one joke about the wrong woman. Within 3 hours, he was choking on his own blood in the basement while Bumpy Johnson held a pair of pliers. The Genovese family, one of the most powerful mafia organizations in America, did nothing. They couldn't, because Gigante had broken a rule that even made men feared to cross. If you're hearing this story for the first time, hit subscribe, because you're about to learn why one name in Harlem could never be spoken. And drop a comment. Where are you watching from right now? Harlem in the 1950s operated under a power structure that outsiders rarely understood. The neighborhood stretched from 110th Street to 155th Street, bounded by Fifth Avenue and the Hudson River. Within those boundaries, multiple criminal organizations competed for territory, but a delicate balance kept open warfare at bay. The Italian Mafia families controlled much of the heroin trade flowing into New York. The Genovese family, led by Vito Genovese, held particular influence over distribution networks. But Harlem itself belonged to Black operators who had built their own systems over decades. These men controlled the numbers rackets, loan sharking operations, and protection schemes that generated millions annually. The arrangement between Italian and Black criminals was not friendship. It was business necessity. The Italians needed local operators who understood Harlem streets and culture. The Black crime bosses needed connections to suppliers and political protection the mafia could provide. This uneasy partnership required mutual respect and clear boundaries. Violating those boundaries carried severe consequences. Territory was divided carefully. The Italians controlled wholesale drug distribution. The Black operators managed street-level sales and gambling operations. Neither side interfered with the other's core business. Money flowed in both directions. Black numbers bankers paid percentages to Italian families for protection and political connections. Italian drug suppliers extended credit to Black distributors based on established relationships and trust. This financial interdependence created stability that benefited everyone involved. But beneath the business arrangements ran deeper currents of tension. Racial prejudice existed on both sides. Many Italian mobsters looked down on their Black partners despite doing business with them. Black crime figures resented needing Italian connections to operate at the highest levels. Violence was always possible. Disputes over money, territory, or respect could escalate quickly. The difference between profitable partnership and deadly warfare often came down to individual relationships between leaders. Men like Bumpy Johnson, who commanded respect from both communities, became essential to maintaining peace. By 1957, this system had functioned for nearly 2 decades. A generation of criminals on both sides had grown wealthy under these arrangements. The older bosses understood the value of stability and cooperation. But younger men, eager to prove themselves, sometimes failed to appreciate the delicate balance their elders had created. Ellsworth Raymond Johnson earned the nickname Bumpy from a large bump on the back of his head, a reminder of childhood violence in Charleston, South Carolina. He arrived in Harlem during the 1930s, when the neighborhood was transforming into a center of Black culture and criminal enterprise. Johnson worked initially for Stephanie St. Clair, known as Madam Queen, who ran the most profitable numbers operation in Harlem. Under her mentorship, Johnson learned the intricate details of illegal gambling, debt collection, and territorial control. The numbers racket generated enormous cash flow by taking small bets from thousands of working-class customers daily. When Dutch Schultz attempted to take over the numbers rackets in the mid-1930s, Johnson fought back with strategic violence that earned him respect throughout the underworld. He organized resistance, protected St. Clair's operations, and made it costly for Schultz to expand into Harlem. After Schultz's murder in 1935, Johnson negotiated directly with Lucky Luciano and the Italian families. These negotiations established a framework for cooperation that would last decades. Johnson proved he could be a reliable partner while also demonstrating he would fight if necessary. He spent time in prison during the 1940s and 1950s on various charges, but his organization continued operating under trusted lieutenants. This proved his power extended beyond personal presence. He had built a system that functioned even in his absence. Upon his release in the mid-1950s, Johnson reclaimed his position as Harlem's most powerful black crime figure. He controlled policy banks across dozens of locations, employed hundreds of runners, and maintained enforcement crews that handled collections and disputes. His operations generated millions in annual revenue. Johnson's reputation was built on calculated brutality. He did not resort to violence impulsively or frequently. But when he decided action was necessary, the response was overwhelming and permanent. Bodies turned up in the Hudson River. Men disappeared without explanation. Witnesses refused to testify. His intelligence matched his capacity for violence. Johnson understood politics, law enforcement, and the complex web of relationships that govern New York's underworld. He paid police and politicians. He maintained informants throughout the city. He knew when investigations were coming and protected his operations accordingly. Men who worked for Johnson understood that loyalty was absolute and betrayal meant death. He rewarded faithful service generously, but punished disloyalty without mercy. This created an organization bound by both fear and respect. His relationship with his wife, Mayme, was well known throughout Harlem. She was not involved in his criminal activities, but everyone understood that disrespecting her was equivalent to disrespecting Bumpy himself. This was not merely Johnson's personal preference. It was an unbreakable rule that defined how he operated in the world. Vincent Louis Gigante grew up in Greenwich Village, the son of Italian immigrants who struggled to make ends meet in Depression-era New York. His family lived in a cramped tenement apartment where multiple generations shared limited space and resources. He showed early promise as a boxer, fighting professionally as a light heavyweight in the late 1940s. His record was unremarkable, winning some fights and losing others, but his willingness to absorb punishment caught the attention of local mobsters who frequented the gyms. Vito Genovese's organization recruited young Italian men from the neighborhood who showed toughness and loyalty. Gigante fit the profile perfectly. He was strong, willing to follow orders, and needed money to support his family. By the early 1950s, Gigante had abandoned boxing to work as an enforcer for the Genovese family. The money was better and more reliable than anything he could earn in legitimate work. He started with simple tasks like delivering messages and collecting small debts. He developed a reputation for following orders without hesitation and carrying out violent acts without leaving witnesses. When told to beat someone, he beat them thoroughly. When told to deliver a warning, the warning was clear and memorable. This reliability made him valuable. In 1957, Gigante was still a young man in his late 20s, proving himself within the organization. He had not yet developed the mental illness act that would later define his public persona and help him avoid prosecution for decades. At this point in his life, Gigante was an ambitious street soldier looking to climb the ranks through loyalty and effectiveness. He wanted to become a made man, to earn his button and be formally inducted into the family. This meant impressing his superiors at every opportunity. Gigante worked primarily in Greenwich Village and parts of Harlem where Italian interests overlapped with Black operators. His role involved collecting payments from gambling operations, delivering messages between different crews, and occasionally administering beatings to those who fell behind on debts or showed disrespect. The Genovese family trusted Gigante with increasingly sensitive operations precisely because he seemed reliable and disciplined. He kept his mouth shut. He did not drink excessively or talk too much. He followed the old mafia codes about discretion and loyalty. But young men seeking status often make mistakes born from overconfidence and the desire to impress peers. Vincent Gigante was about to make the biggest mistake of his life. The Italian Mafia's relationship with Harlem's Black crime figures operated on clearly defined terms established in the late 1930s. After Lucky Luciano brokered peace following the Castellamarese War, the five families divided New York into territories and spheres of influence. Harlem represented a special case because its population and culture made it difficult for Italian criminals to operate directly without drawing attention. White mobsters conducting business in a predominantly black neighborhood attracted police scrutiny and created tension with local residents. The solution was partnership rather than conquest. Italian families supplied heroin and other narcotics to black distributors who moved the product through their own networks. The Italians received a percentage of profits and maintained ultimate authority over supply chains. In exchange, black operators like Bumpy Johnson retained autonomy over their street-level operations and kept the majority of earnings from numbers, loans, and local rackets. This division of labor maximized profits for both sides while minimizing conflicts. The arrangement required constant communication and dispute resolution. Meetings between Italian and black crime leaders happened regularly at neutral locations, usually restaurants or social clubs where both sides felt secure. These meetings addressed problems before they escalated into violence. Bumpy Johnson attended these meetings as an equal, commanding respect from mafia bosses who understood his power in Harlem. Unlike some black operators who deferred to Italian authority, Johnson negotiated from strength. He controlled territory the Italians needed access to. The Genovese family, in particular, maintained close ties with Johnson's operation. They shared intelligence about law enforcement activities and coordinated responses to threats from rival organizations. When federal investigations targeted narcotics trafficking, both sides warned each other and adjusted operations. This cooperation extended to violence when necessary. If someone threatened the partnership or violated agreements, both sides worked together to eliminate the problem. Bodies of those who broke rules turned up as warnings to others. But this partnership had clear limits. Personal matters remained separate from business. Family members on both sides were considered off limits for disrespect or involvement in criminal disputes. Wives, children, and relatives existed in a protected space. The wives of crime bosses were especially protected. In the male-dominated underworld of the 1950s, women connected to powerful men occupied a special status. They were not involved in criminal activities and therefore could not be targeted in disputes. This code was not written down anywhere, but every man in the underworld knew it as thoroughly as they knew their own names. Violating this code meant crossing a line that would trigger immediate and severe consequences regardless of other business relationships. Men could disagree about money, territory, or business deals and potentially resolve those disputes through negotiation. But disrespecting a boss's wife was personal. It could not be negotiated away or settled with money. Mayme Hatcher met Ellsworth Johnson in the 1940s when he was already established as a significant figure in Harlem's underworld. She came from a respectable background and initially had no connection to criminal activity. Her family attended church regularly and worked legitimate jobs. Their relationship developed despite the obvious dangers and complications of Johnson's life. Mayme saw beyond the violent reputation to the man underneath. Johnson, for his part, found in Mayme something he had never experienced in the brutal world he inhabited. They married in the late 1940s, and Mayme became the center of Johnson's personal world, completely separate from his criminal empire. She maintained a household that operated as a sanctuary from the violence and chaos of the streets. Mayme was known throughout Harlem as an elegant, dignified woman who carried herself with grace and confidence. She dressed impeccably, spoke with intelligence and refinement, and commanded respect through her bearing rather than any connection to criminal activity. She attended church regularly, participated in community activities, and maintained friendships with people who had no idea of her husband's true occupation. Many knew Johnson as a successful businessman who owned legitimate properties and businesses in Harlem. Johnson protected this separation fiercely. He never discussed business matters at home and ensured that his criminal associates understood Mayme was completely off limits. She represented the one aspect of his life that remained clean, untouched by the corruption and violence that defined everything else. Their home was a space where Johnson could escape the constant calculations and violence of his criminal enterprise. With Mayme, he could be simply a husband rather than a crime boss weighing life and death decisions daily. Other crime figures in Harlem respected this boundary without question. Even Johnson's enemies, and he had many, understood that targeting Mayme would trigger a response so devastating that no one would survive it. The cost would be too high. Her name was simply not spoken in the context of street business, jokes, or disrespect. To mention Mayme Johnson in any inappropriate way was to invite immediate and permanent consequences. This was understood as clearly as any written law. Every man in Harlem's underworld knew this rule. The Italian mobsters who did business with Johnson knew it. The police who took his money knew it. The young criminals coming up through the ranks learned it early. Apparently, Vincent Gigante had not learned it yet. Or perhaps he had learned it but failed to appreciate its absolute nature. The incident occurred in late September 1957 at a social club on 116th Street, where Italian and Black criminals occasionally gathered for informal meetings. The club operated as a neutral space where business could be discussed away from the streets and law enforcement surveillance. The exact details of what Gigante said vary depending on who tells the story, but the core facts remain consistent across all accounts. Multiple witnesses were present, and while they might disagree on specific words, they agreed on what happened. Gigante was drinking with several other Genovese soldiers and a few of Bumpy Johnson's associates. The atmosphere was relaxed, with men sharing stories and jokes as they often did during these mixed gatherings. Money had been collected, debts had been paid, and everyone was in good spirits. At some point in the evening, the conversation turned to women and relationships. This was common talk among groups of men drinking together. Stories were told, exaggerations were made, and jokes flew freely. Gigante, emboldened by alcohol and perhaps seeking to impress the other Italians present, made a joke that referenced Maine Johnson by name. The specific words of the joke have been lost to time, but witnesses agreed it was sexual in nature and disrespectful in tone. Some accounts suggest Gigante was trying to bond with the Italian mobsters by making a crude joke at the expense of a Black woman, not understanding or caring about the consequences. Other versions suggest he was drunk and simply speaking without thinking. The moment the words left Gigante's mouth, the room went silent. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. Men who had been laughing seconds before now stared at Gigante with expressions of shock and horror. Johnson's men stopped talking immediately, their faces showing first shock and then fear. They knew exactly what was coming. They understood the magnitude of what had just happened. One of them, an enforcer named Willie, who had worked for Johnson for over a decade, stood up without saying a word and left the club. He did not run, but he walked with purpose. Everyone in the room knew where he was going and why. Willie walked directly to the brownstone on 135th Street, where Bumpy Johnson was meeting with his top lieutenants about an unrelated business matter. The meeting was important, discussing territory and money, but Willie interrupted it anyway. Interrupting Johnson's private meetings was itself a serious breach of protocol that could result in punishment. Men did not disturb the boss unless circumstances were genuinely urgent. Willie's willingness to interrupt indicated he understood this was an emergency. He leaned close to Johnson and whispered what Gigante had said. The exact words Willie used to report the incident have not been recorded, but he conveyed both what was said and where Gigante currently was. Witnesses who were present at that meeting later described Johnson's reaction. His face showed no emotion, no anger, no surprise, nothing. He simply nodded slowly, stood up from his chair, and told his men to get their coats. Within 15 minutes, Johnson and 6 of his most trusted enforcers were in 2 cars heading toward 116th Street. By the time Johnson arrived at the social club, word had already spread through Harlem's underworld that something catastrophic was about to happen. The criminal grapevine worked faster than any modern communication system. Men called friends, friends called associates, and within 30 minutes, everyone knew. The club had mostly emptied out. Patrons who had been drinking and socializing suddenly remembered they had somewhere else to be. The bartender busied himself cleaning glasses at the far end of the bar, his back turned to the door. Gigante remained inside with two other Genovese soldiers. Whether he was unaware of the severity of his mistake, too proud to run, or simply too drunk to make rational decisions remains unclear. But he was still sitting at the same table when Johnson arrived. Johnson entered through the front door with his men behind him. No one tried to stop them. The bartender did not ask questions or object. He had worked in Harlem long enough to know when to mind his own business. The few remaining patrons immediately moved to the far corners of the room, pressing themselves against walls and making themselves as small and invisible as possible. They would later claim to investigators that they saw nothing and heard nothing. Johnson walked directly to the table where Gigante sat. His movements were calm and deliberate. He showed no signs of anger or excitement. To witnesses, he appeared to be conducting routine business. According to multiple accounts, Johnson did not raise his voice. He simply stood at the table and asked Gigante if he had something to say about Mayme. His tone was conversational, almost polite. Gigante, still not fully grasping the situation, or perhaps trying to bluff his way through it, attempted to laugh it off. He said it was just a joke, nothing serious, just men talking the way men talked. Johnson nodded slowly, as if considering this explanation. Then he turned to his men and gave a single instruction in a quiet voice. Take him to the basement. Those 3 words changed everything. Gigante's face transformed from forced confidence to genuine terror. He finally understood what was about to happen. The alcohol cleared from his mind in an instant, replaced by pure survival instinct. He reached for a gun tucked in his waistband, but Johnson's enforcers were faster and had been expecting exactly this response. They grabbed Gigante's arms before his fingers touched the weapon. They slammed him face first onto the table hard enough that the sound echoed through the now silent room. The 2 other Genovese soldiers who had been sitting with Gigante started to stand up, starting to intervene to protect their associate. But Johnson turned his head and looked at them with an expression that stopped them cold. This was between him and Gigante now. Any interference would mean war between the organizations. It would mean the profitable partnership between Italian and Black criminals would end in bloodshed. Both sides would lose money, territory, and men. The Italian soldiers understood this calculation immediately. They also understood that Gigante had broken a rule that transcended organizational loyalty. He had disrespected a boss's wife. The code was clear about such violations. They backed down. They sat back in their chairs and watched as Johnson's men dragged Gigante toward the back of the club, toward the stairs that led to the basement storage area. Gigante was screaming now, begging, promising he meant no disrespect. Johnson followed silently behind them. What happened in that basement has been described in various accounts over the years, each version adding or subtracting details, but the essential facts remain undisputed. The core of what occurred is confirmed by too many sources to be dismissed as legend. Johnson's men held Gigante down. The young enforcer was still pleading, still trying to apologize, his voice rising in pitch as fear overwhelmed him. He promised he had meant no disrespect, that he was drunk, that he would never speak of Mayme again. Johnson stood over him and explained very calmly, in an almost educational tone, that certain lines could never be crossed. Mayme's name, Johnson said, should never have entered Gigante's mouth. Since Gigante had used his tongue to disrespect her, that tongue needed to be dealt with. Gigante began screaming in earnest, thrashing against the men holding him. But Johnson's enforcers were professionals who had restrained struggling men many times before. They knew how to apply pressure, where to grip, how to immobilize someone completely. Johnson pulled out a pair of pliers from his coat pocket. He had brought them specifically for this purpose, which meant he had planned the punishment before even arriving at the club. This was not a spontaneous act of rage, but a calculated decision. Johnson's enforcers pried Gigante's mouth open and held his head in place. The young Italian mobster's screams became muffled, gargled sounds as his mouth was forced wide. Johnson gripped Gigante's tongue with the pliers and pulled. According to witnesses who heard Gigante's account later, the pain was beyond description. Gigante's muffled screams filled the basement. Johnson did not rip the tongue out entirely, despite what the legend later claimed. Instead, he tore it partially, ripping the flesh and muscle severely enough to cause permanent damage and unbearable pain, but leaving it attached. This was deliberate. A completely severed tongue would have meant Gigante might bleed to death, which would trigger war between the organizations. Johnson was sending a message, not starting a conflict. The torture lasted several minutes. When Johnson finally released the pliers, Gigante collapsed, semi-conscious from pain and shock. Blood filled his mouth, but not enough to be life-threatening. Johnson leaned close to Gigante's ear and spoke his final words. He told Gigante that he was being allowed to live only because killing a made man would start a war. But if Gigante ever spoke Mayme's name again, if he ever forgot this lesson, Johnson would finish what he started. The message was clear. This punishment was mercy. This was restraint. Johnson had the power to do much worse, but was choosing not to out of respect for the business relationship between organizations. Then Johnson and his men walked out of the basement, leaving Gigante bleeding and broken on the floor. They walked through the club, past the terrified witnesses, and out into the Harlem night. By morning, everyone in New York's underworld would know what had happened and why. The aftermath of the incident rippled through New York's underworld with the force of an earthquake. News traveled through every borough, every crew, every organization. Within days, criminals in Brooklyn, Queens, the Bronx, and even New Jersey had heard the story. Gigante was found by his fellow Genovese soldiers and rushed to a doctor who treated mob injuries off the books. These doctors asked no questions and filed no police reports. They stitched wounds, set bones, and removed bullets for cash. His tongue was not completely severed, but the damage was severe enough that he required surgery and months of recovery. He would speak with difficulty for the rest of his life, though he eventually regained most function. Every word he spoke for the next 40 years would remind him of this night. The Genovese family faced a critical decision. Gigante was one of their soldiers. Johnson had brutalized him in a way that demanded retaliation under traditional mafia codes. Allowing such an act to go unanswered could be seen as weakness. But the family's leadership understood the context. Vito Genovese himself was consulted about how to respond. After hearing the full story, including exactly what Gigante had said, Genovese made a pragmatic choice. He sent word to Johnson that the matter was considered closed. Gigante had violated an understood boundary and paid the price. No revenge would be sought. The business relationship between the organizations would continue as before. This decision shocked many of the younger Italian mobsters who felt their organization had been disrespected. They argued for retaliation, for hitting Johnson's operations, for proving that Genovese soldiers could not be touched. But the older, wiser bosses understood that going to war with Johnson over this would cost more than it was worth. Johnson controlled Harlem completely. A conflict would disrupt the highly profitable drug and gambling operations that both sides depended on. More importantly, Johnson had been right. Gigante had broken the code. The unwritten rules that governed the underworld were clear about respecting bosses' families. Violating those rules had consequences. The message Johnson sent that night traveled far beyond Harlem. Every criminal organization in New York heard the story within days. Bumpy Johnson had reinforced his reputation as a man who could not be crossed, even by the Italian Mafia, even by made men in powerful families. The Vincent Gigante incident became one of the most frequently told stories in New York's underworld for decades afterward. It served as a teaching tool for young criminals learning the unwritten rules of organized crime. Older mobsters would tell the story to recruits and associates as a lesson about respect and boundaries. The message was simple. Certain lines could never be crossed, regardless of who you were or what organization you represented. Respect was not optional. It was the foundation of everything in the criminal world. Without respect, there could be no trust. Without trust, there could be no business. Without business, the whole system collapsed into chaos and violence. Boundaries around family were absolute. A man's wife and children existed in a protected space separate from criminal activities. Violating that space was worse than stealing money or encroaching on territory. It was personal in a way that could not be resolved through negotiation. And certain men, like Bumpy Johnson, operated on a level where even the mafia calculated carefully before challenging them. Power came not just from violence or money, but from the respect that made other powerful men think twice. Gigante himself learned the lesson permanently. After recovering from his injuries, he never again showed the same arrogance or carelessness. He became known for being quiet, careful, and extremely calculating. Some historians of organized crime believe this incident contributed to Gigante's later strategy of feigning mental illness. Having experienced firsthand what happened when he appeared too confident and capable, Gigante may have decided that appearing weak and mentally unstable offered better protection than projecting strength. He would go on to become boss of the Genovese's family, walking the streets of Greenwich Village in a bathrobe and slippers, mumbling to himself, convincing law enforcement and rivals alike that he was incapacitated. But those who knew the full story understood that beneath that act was a man who had learned brutal lessons about power, respect, and consequences. Bumpy Johnson died in 1968, collapsing from a heart attack in a Harlem restaurant. Thousands attended his funeral. Mayme Johnson lived for decades after her husband's death, carrying the legacy of a woman whose name alone had commanded absolute respect in one of America's most dangerous criminal underworlds. She died in 2009, having outlived both her husband and Vincent Gigante by years.